The banging didn't stop for 3 hours. Not from construction, but from the inside. Margaret Fletcher, self-appointed empress of the Clearbrook Heights HOA, was pounding her perfectly manicured fingernails against the steel interior of my newly built workshop wall, screaming about unlawful imprisonment and violation of proper storage protocols. I sipped my coffee, turned up the radio, and admired the clean drywall I'd just finished installing on the side that didn't contain Margaret. Let me back up. My name's Daniel Morrison, a retired electrical engineer who moved to Clearbrook Heights for some peace and a garage big enough to house my vintage motorcycle restoration projects. I built a simple, tastefully designed workshop in my backyard, nothing fancy, just clean lines and proper ventilation. But that didn't sit right with Margaret Fletcher, the HOA president who ran the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom. Margaret drove a pristine white Cadillac, wore coordinated pastel outfits to the grocery store, and had filed noise complaints against wind chimes, actual wind chimes. Her house had 6 security cameras and a neighborhood watch coordinator sign prominently displayed. She also maintained a clipboard that never left her side, filled with what she called community improvement observations. My sin? Constructing a permitted, HOA-approved workshop without consulting her personally about aesthetic integration. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after I finished the concrete foundation. Margaret appeared at my front door at 7:15 in the morning, clipboard in hand, wearing a lime green tracksuit that somehow made her look more official than intimidating. "Daniel, we need to discuss your construction project's impact on neighborhood property values," she announced, inviting herself onto my porch. I explained that I had all the proper permits, HOA approval, and professional blueprints. Margaret squinted at my paperwork like it was written in ancient hieroglyphics. "These documents don't address the psychological impact of industrial structures on residential tranquility," she declared. I wasn't even sure what that meant, but I had a feeling I was about to find out. First came the citations: roof angle does not complement community harmony. Tool storage visible from street creates industrial appearance. And my personal favorite, metal shavings may contaminate neighboring flower beds. Each citation arrived in my mailbox with official HOA letterhead and Margaret's signature in purple ink. When I ignored her increasingly bizarre demands, she escalated her campaign into something resembling performance art. Margaret began conducting what she called neighborhood wellness patrols, specifically focused on my property. She would appear at random times with a measuring tape, notepad, and sometimes a folding chair, positioning herself on the sidewalk to document what she termed compliance irregularities. I watched from my kitchen window as she spent an entire afternoon measuring the distance between my workshop and the property line, taking notes, and occasionally shaking her head in disapproval. She started dropping by unannounced during my restoration sessions, demanding detailed explanations of my work. She filmed me on her phone while providing running commentary like a nature documentary narrator. Here we observe the resident in his natural habitat, demonstrating concerning levels of mechanical enthusiasm, she would narrate while I tried to focus on carburetor adjustments. The filming escalated when Margaret discovered I was restoring a 1967 Harley-Davidson shovelhead. She became convinced this was evidence of my motorcycle gang affiliations, and began documenting what she called suspicious vehicular activity. Never mind that the bike hadn't run in 15 years and was currently missing an engine block. Once, I caught her measuring my workshop's footprint while muttering calculations about permissible square footage ratios. She had apparently memorized the entire HOA covenant and could quote specific subsections about outbuilding regulations from memory. The woman had turned neighborhood management into a full-time obsession. Margaret's surveillance techniques became increasingly sophisticated. She installed what she claimed was a decorative bird feeder on a 10-foot pole position to overlook my backyard. The feeder never contained bird seed, but it did contain a small camera that she checked daily with binoculars from her bedroom window. When I pointed this out at the next HOA meeting, she claimed it was for wildlife observation purposes. Then came the neighborhood gossip campaign. I was running an unlicensed auto repair business, storing hazardous chemicals, and attracting undesirable motorcycle enthusiasts. She created a 3-page newsletter titled Community Safety Concerns that she distributed to every mailbox, complete with poorly taken photos of my workshop and dramatic captions like "Industrial infiltration threatens suburban serenity." The newsletter was a masterpiece of suburban paranoia. Margaret had somehow convinced herself that my completely legal hobby constituted a threat to everything from property values to local wildlife. She included a hand-drawn map showing the contamination radius of my workshop and suggested that neighbors install air purifiers as a precautionary measure. All of this was completely false. Well, except for the enthusiasts part, but they were perfectly desirable people who appreciated vintage Harleys and brought me coffee when they stopped by to admire the restoration work. Margaret, however, treated each visitor like they were conducting drug deals in my driveway. One Tuesday afternoon, I returned from the parts store to find Margaret inside my locked workshop, reorganizing my socket sets and labeling my tool chest drawers with her own color-coded system. "Just conducting a routine HOA safety inspection," she announced cheerfully, as if breaking and entering was part of her official duties. That's when I noticed the lock had been cut clean through with bolt cutters. She had trespassed, vandalized my property, and was reorganizing my carburetor rebuild kit by perceived community threat level. My vintage Craftsman wrenches were now sorted into categories labeled acceptable, questionable, and requires supervision. Margaret had also taken the liberty of installing what she called safety improvements throughout my workshop. She'd placed reflective tape on every tool handle, hung motivational posters about responsible craftsmanship, and somehow acquired a fire extinguisher that she'd mounted prominently near my workbench with a sign reading Margaret Fletcher Memorial Safety Station. The most audacious part was her workshop compliance binder, a 3-ring folder containing laminated pages of new rules she'd created specifically for my space. These included mandatory safety glasses for all visitors, a sign-in log for anyone entering the workshop, and a requirement that I submit weekly progress reports on all restoration projects to the HOA board. I called the sheriff's department immediately. Deputy Williams actually chuckled when I described the situation. "Is this the same lady who called 911 about teenagers playing basketball too enthusiastically?" he asked. Yes. Yes, it was exactly that lady. The same Margaret who had also reported suspicious unauthorized walking when neighbors took evening strolls without following her suggested route map. Deputy Williams arrived within 20 minutes, took one look at the bolt cutters Margaret had carelessly left on my workbench, and immediately understood the situation. Margaret tried to explain that she had implied consent to enter based on HOA authority, but the deputy was having none of it. He'd apparently dealt with Margaret's creative interpretation of community leadership before. Turns out, Margaret had absolutely no authority to conduct any inspection whatsoever, and her trespassing voided all future claims against my property. Deputy Williams issued her a formal warning and instructed her to stay at least 15 feet away from my workshop. He also suggested that Margaret might want to review the actual HOA bylaws rather than the expanded version she'd apparently written herself. Margaret retaliated the very next morning by placing orange traffic cones around my driveway with handwritten signs reading, "Caution, Noise Violation Zone." She'd also distributed flyers to the neighborhood warning about increased mechanical activity, and suggesting that residents avoid my street during peak disturbance hours, which she'd helpfully defined as any time I was actually working in my workshop. That was the final straw, literally the final piece of lumber I needed. I had my contractor buddy Jake fast-track the interior wall I was planning to add, dividing the workshop into separate project and storage areas. Jake thought I was just being practical about organization, but I had a more specific purpose in mind. The next morning, I left my workshop door conspicuously unlocked and made sure to drive away at exactly the time Margaret usually began her neighborhood wellness patrol. I parked around the corner and waited, watching through my phone's security camera app as Margaret approached my workshop, looked around dramatically, and then slipped inside. I gave her exactly 15 minutes to get comfortable before returning. By the time I walked into my workshop, Margaret had already begun implementing what she called emergency organizational protocols. She was wearing latex gloves and had somehow produced a label maker from her purse, busily creating new identification tags for my drill bits. While Margaret snuck in again to verify compliance with updated HOA guidelines, I quietly installed the final wall panel from the outside. Jake had built a wall system with removable panels for easy installation, which meant I could complete the final section in about 10 minutes while Margaret was distracted by the chaos of reorganizing my bolt collection. The look on her face when she realized what had happened was absolutely priceless. Margaret had been so focused on her labeling project that she hadn't noticed the new wall going up behind her. When she finally turned around and saw a solid drywall where the door used to be, her expression went through several stages of confusion, indignation, and then pure outrage. "Daniel Morrison, you remove this wall immediately," she shouted, pounding on the drywall with her fists. "This is a clear violation of subsection 9 regarding member access to common areas." I gently explained through the wall that my workshop was not a common area and that she was currently trespassing for the second time in 3 days. I slid a camping lantern, a bottle of water, and a complete printed copy of the HOA bylaws through the gap before sealing the door completely. She spent the next 4 hours alternating between demanding immediate release and lecturing the walls about subsection 12C regarding member conduct expectations. At one point, she tried to negotiate her release by promising to approve all future workshop modifications without review. The entertainment value was incredible. Margaret had apparently memorized large portions of the HOA covenant and was reciting them to my tools as if they were her captive audience. She also attempted to continue her organizational project, creating detailed inventory lists of my equipment and leaving them in neat stacks for my review. When Deputy Williams arrived, he knocked politely on the wall and called out, "Margaret, you comfortable in there, or do you need us to discuss your trespassing charges?" The HOA board had already been contacted. Apparently, I wasn't her only victim. Margaret had attempted to fine a neighbor for non-regulation mailbox enthusiasm, and one-sided a family for excessive holiday decoration brightness levels. The board voted to remove her from all positions. Unanimously. Margaret Fletcher was escorted from the property by sheriff's deputies, screaming about a conspiracy against proper neighborhood standards and a violation of her constitutional right to community oversight.